Hello everybody, it's time for another online lecture for SWO 441 macro practice. What we're going to be talking about today is community organization, conceptualization, and approaches. So I'm going to start by defining a few terms for you. And you probably remember from 302, what is a community? A community is basically a group of people that have some sort of shared identity. It can be defined by people within the community. It could be defined by people outside of the community. And how do we know it's a community and not just a bunch of random people? Again, they have to have some identity in common. So for example, you are part of the community of social work students at Brockport. You're also part of the overall social work community in the United States. Your class is its own community in that you are section 2 of the macro practice class for this semester. So you can have a shared identity, a cultural identity. You can have some sort of a shared need. You can also be just shared by geography. Right now I'm sitting here as part of the Brockport community. In terms of the village of Brockport. The Brockport campus community is defined by the boundaries of the campus. So those are some of the ways you can define what a community is. Communities have a number of functions. They perform the function of socialization, and again, giving that shared identity and letting people interact and learn how to engage in interpersonal communication and existence with other people. They also have the function of production, distribution, and consumption. They also have the function of social controls, in that within a community, generally you will have some norms and values that are somewhat standard within the community. So for example, within the community of the United States, one of the primary norms or values that's shared is the value of freedom. The concept of freedom is something that to various extremes is held very dear by most people in this country. And people in other cultures view freedom as an entirely different concept. There are certain things that are normal or acceptable here in the United States that are not normal or acceptable in other countries. So piggybacking off of another lecture I did today on healthcare, in the United States, overall, institutionally, healthcare is viewed as a privilege as opposed to a right. Some people in the United States have healthcare, many don't. Some people have excellent healthcare, some barely have the minimal to survive. Whereas in many, I would say most, other fully developed countries, healthcare is considered a right that is provided by the government. So that is a social control that is different between our culture and other cultures. It also provides mutual support. I'm hoping that those of you within this class are still in contact with each other and you're providing support to each other. You, within your time in the social work program at Brockport, hopefully you have found some of those mutual supports that make you part of the Brockport community. And a community also gives you the opportunity to participate. So in the United States, we participate by voting. We participate by engaging in social action. And as we're going to talk about today, we participate by engaging in community activity and community organizing. What makes working with a community different from any other client system is that a community, it's usually a whole bunch of people. And while you will have some shared identity within that community, you'll also have plenty of differences and plenty of variability. You may have differing agendas. Just because people may identify as being part of the social work community, it doesn't mean that necessarily you have anything else in common with the other people that are in your community. So when you are a social worker working in a community, you have to look at a lot of other variables and factors that you don't necessarily have to think about when you're working with a family or a couple. Community engagement is key to a healthy democracy, because a democracy, the very foundation of it is a voice equals a vote, or one voice equals an equal say in how the community works. You can't have a voice, you can't have a say if you don't participate as part of your community. However, even though we say that, there's plenty that gets in the way of that in terms of our own laws, voter restrictions, and just lack of access to having your voice heard. We've talked a little bit about human capital. Human capital is basically the potential of human beings to do what they do, to engage, to create. It's kind of what you contribute to the society. Whereas social capital is more of how you as an individual act, what your skills are, what your talents are. Social capital can also consist of bonding and bridging. That's the ability to bring people together and the ability to create connections. Instrumental ties, so people who have a connection to each other because one way or another, what they do supports or helps another person. They actually fulfill a true function in someone else's life. There's also affective ties, meaning the ties that come from emotion and connection. And normative ties, the ties that come from having certain values and norms that are in common. So when you think about maybe a religious community, you have the instrumental tie of, being there as a social support. Maybe if one family within a congregation is having trouble, maybe the church rallies people to come and help. You have the affective ties in that you form human relationships. You also have the normative ties in that you share a common faith base. Human and social capital are so important because they are basically what ties people and groups together and forms them as communities and helps them function as communities and as larger social units. Community organizing strengthens human and social capital because it gives you a buy-in to the functioning and health of the community. And it also provides a voice so that more people can have a say in how the community functions and whether things are working or not working. A social worker in the community can do a number of things. And I know most students come in wanting to engage in micro, maybe meso practice, and that's fine. And a lot of people say, well, what can a social worker do on the macro level? And the answer is a lot. So a social worker doing macro practice can engage in advocacy. That's large-scale advocacy, cause advocacy as opposed to case advocacy. Social action, the promotion of social and economic justice. They can help communities to identify broad and systemic quality of life issues, some of what we're seeing right now. They can be part of political lobbying for policy change. Assessing, doing community assessments, as we've talked about in class before, identifying service gaps within a community. Again, that policy work, and professional participation and coalition building. That's just a snapshot of some of the ways that social workers can engage in macro level action. Community, and one of the reasons why we always need social workers to engage in community practice is that communities often change. And with change comes new needs and new gaps and just changes in dynamics. So some of the things that have happened in communities to require the need for more social workers is competition for resources, urbanization, which we've spoken about in other classes. Urbanization basically being the flight of people to urban centers, and basically the spread of urban dynamics outside of the original geographic boundaries of cities. Suburbanization and white flight. So after white folks fill up those urban centers and change them, then all of a sudden they decide the dynamic is no longer good, and then they leave the cities and start suburbs, leaving primarily poor, non-white people in the cities to deal with the fallout. You have centralization and zoning. Different parts of communities are zoned for different things. Where I live right now is zoned for residential. Main Street in Brockport is zoned for commercial, retail, might be zoned for food service. So communities change how they're zoned. You will see a lot of times that depending on how communities are zoned and where certain types of entities are, is where different demographics of community residents tend to end up. So more often than not, non-white poor folks end up closer to the industrial zoned areas, the factories, the warehouses, the sanitation plants, things like that. You also have the issue of concentration in cultural enclaves. So what happens is, as people from other cultures come into this country, they tend to find themselves isolated even within other communities because of being othered by the host culture. So they form little cultural pockets, or as they used to be called, or sometimes still are called, ghettos. I think when I think of the term ghetto, I think actually back to the World War II era. And the fact that in Krakow, Poland, the Jewish section of the city was called the Krakow Ghetto, because that was where they basically forced the entire Jewish portion of the community to live so that they could be regulated and controlled. You have the issue of invasion, the issue of gentrification, which I know is spoken about in other classes, which is basically where you have, usually in a city area, that usually is primarily lived in and socialized in by people from certain racial and ethnic backgrounds. And then usually the white folks come in and say, oh, I'm going to do some community revitalization. And they end up taking out these nice quaint markets and little shops and turning them into coffee bars and kombucha bars and little cafes, and rents go up, and then usually the people that have lived there for generations get forced out because they can no longer afford to live there, and their entire way of life is basically erased. And then succession is the product of invasion and or gentrification, which is when the whole cycle begins again. So when we assess communities, we did talk already about the SWOT analysis. You have to think about the fact that words have meanings. So I call it a community assessment, because a community assessment merely indicates that you're looking at a community just to see what's going on. When you say, I'm going to do a needs assessment, you are making the assumption before ever going into the community that there's something that they need or some deficit that they're experiencing. And it's really up to the community to decide if they have needs or not. It's not up to us as social workers to go into a community that's not ours and say, oh, these are all the problems that you're having. Believe me, people in communities know if they're having problems. They don't need us to tell them what they are. You should always go into a community and assess them, with basically providing support to people who already live there, to key stakeholders. You want to do it in a way that is sensitive to the needs, the norms, and values of the community. You're going to assess their informal and formal institutions. You're going to assess their education. You're maybe going to assess their financial institutions, government, maybe their law enforcement agencies, and just kind of see what's going on. And then from there, maybe you work with the stakeholders in the community to determine if indeed there are needs, and then how those needs are best remedied. So you would use, again, something like the SWOT model, and you would define the scope of data to collect. What is it you're actually looking at? Determine who's going to be involved. You're going to gather your data, identify your findings, establish priorities and an action plan. And again, this is all in collaboration with community stakeholders. And then you're going to disseminate your results. You don't want to go into a community and come to conclusions and then just go on your merry way. Part of your responsibility ethically is to disseminate those results to the community that you just assessed. So some of the key points of community practice are, first, you have to determine a vision for social justice. And we've talked about that in this class already. What would a more just world look like? And is it from your standpoint or the standpoint of the community you're working with? Understanding what realizing that vision would look like to vulnerable communities and the people within it. You have to have empathy for the causal experiences that precipitated the current state. So that's taking away from the deficit model and looking at a structural model and saying, if your community has fallen on hard times, that is not because of a moral failing on the part of the community members. It's because of some usually longstanding structural issue that rendered people in the community powerless to stop their situation. You have to have a deep and broad understanding about the complex ideas of empowerment, which we've discussed, being able to reflect critically on what the situation is and what your role is, and the concept of limiting notions, which is basically saying that as soon as you say that something is impossible to change, it is. So you have to go in with the belief that anything is possible. You have to have the ability to describe the social structure inside the community and outside the community, anything that helps to precipitate, maintain, and reinforce any adverse conditions. And again, reframe that pathologizing client problem. Look into a holistic and social structural approach. This community is not experiencing issues because the people within it are bad. It's because the structure is not set up for these people to be successful or for these people to be healthy. I'm going to talk a moment about Gershon's empowerment methodology. So Gershon basically is one of the pioneers of community practice and has an entire framework on how to be empowered to engage in community change. So again, suspend your assumptions and rethink your assumed limitations. Don't believe that anything is impossible, and why should you accept limitations? Reflect on your personal vision and what brought you to social work. Think about who your clients are. What are their vantage points and perceptions? How do they perceive their reality? What is important and valuable to them? What is your vantage point, possibly in contrast to that? Why do you serve your clients? What is your entire purpose for being here? And what has brought your clients to where they are today? So to simplify, Gershon's empowerment methodology calls for awareness of where you are now, vision of where you want to go, transformation of what change you need to make to get to where you want to go, and growth. What is your next step? So where are you now? Where do you want to be? What does that change look like? And what is the next step to getting there? And there are 4 transformative core beliefs in contrast to those limiting beliefs. First is self-responsibility, holding yourself accountable for being a part of positive change. Self-esteem, believing that you have the wherewithal and the ability and talent to do it. Trust, and that's trust in yourself and trust in the people engaging in the change process with you. And trying to have a positive attitude, which I know can be challenging, but without a positive attitude, you will never be able to engage in positive change. And it's so important because engaging in large-scale change takes time and it takes stamina. So when you're looking at a community and you're looking at how to define a social problem, you have to look at how you're framing the problem. How are decisions made in a community? Is that part of the problem? Are decisions made by one elite group of stakeholders, as they are in this country for the most part? Or is it truly a democratic process where everybody, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of race, culture, ethnicity, what have you, has an equal voice? Who has the capacity to carry out the decisions, and can they be trusted to do so? Who benefits from the solutions? How are societal resources allocated, and who makes those decisions? Do we need social mobilization, such as rallies, demonstrations, protests? Or do we need to take a social production approach, which is direct service provision, building homes, and creating jobs? Which of those, or a hybrid of those sets of techniques, is needed to create the change that the community requires? So to identify what a social problem is, it has to be experienced by more than a few people. It has to be something that creates a community of suffering. It has to derive from the way society is structured. So it has to be sort of a long-standing, large-scale issue. It can often be difficult to see. It's something that usually is underlined by either saying, this is just how things are done, or this is just how it's always been. Usually if there's something that you say, why is this happening? And someone say, that's just the way it's always been, pretty good chance it's a social problem. And it has to be reflective of the existence of inequality and power differentials in society. So in order to design that transformative community change strategy, you have to create a positive vision of change, empower individuals to grow through participation in the transformative change strategy. So people become empowered by participating in their own change and growth. Implement that transformative change strategy through social diffusion. Start it with a small core area and then let it diffuse through the society as people become more enthused and they see change beginning to happen. And again, it's a marathon, not a race, as we keep hearing on all of these innumerable briefings about the virus right now. It is a marathon, not a race. It takes stamina. It takes a lot of forbearance. So create a support system for individuals participating in that transformative change initiative. A few of the models to community organizing is social action, locality development and civic organizing, social planning, community building, women-centered and feminist movements, and consensus organizing. Consensus organizing in particular starts with social capital and with networks. You begin with activities, and then short-term and intermediate outcomes, and then long-term outcomes. And there's usually a bi-directional relationship to opportunities for social change, meaning that as people within a community begin changing the community, that change in the community will then begin reflecting on the people that are doing the work. So that is all I have for you today. We have a few more lessons left for this semester. I hope you guys are hanging in there. Hope you're doing all right. You're staying sane, washing your hands, maintaining social distancing, and you're healthy and well. And hopefully I will see you guys soon. Have a good week.